So thank you everybody for turning up today. And I have a few obligatory things to say. So welcome to the Republic of Work Lunch and Learn series. They're held every Tuesday at 1 p.m. And it's a webinar format, obviously. There are always a variety of business topics that people can learn from, and you can find upcoming events on the What's On section of the Republic of Work website, republicofwork.com. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about fundraising, and the title of this is There's Money Out There. Obviously, this is about fundraising in this particular time, and at the same time, much of what I'm going to share is generally applicable. Now, there's a chat window in Zoom, so if people want to ask questions, either you can raise your hand or you can put them in the text chat, and I will try to get to them after some initial introductory thoughts. And so without further ado, I'm going to dive in. I think one of the things that is super important in this time is, if you're raising money, how do you approach investors? And there have been many books written on this, but I have a particular way of approaching investors that I like, and I think it works particularly well in these times. Because right now you have a limited opportunity to meet investors serendipitously. So there aren't a lot of face-to-face meetups and conferences. There's not a lot of interaction that there normally would be. And so you've got to look at how you can get in front of the right investor, and you've got to actually look at ways to get at them or get to them that they're going to find acceptable and interesting. Now, the first thing that I recommend is that you do your homework. It's not enough just to meet investors. You need to meet specific kinds of investors, and that requires a bit of homework. So the first thing is, as a venture capitalist out there in the world, you generally will have a mandate from your investors, your limited partners that are invested in your fund, to invest in a certain way at a certain kind of stage for a certain kind of opportunity. And it's really not useful to meet opportunities that are outside of your investment horizon or your investment kind. You simply can't do that investment in many cases. So this is where, in capital raising, your homework is essential. And you need to look at a variety of things. Firstly, you need to try and find out what industry, what sector an investor is investing in or has invested in. Secondly, you've got to find out what stage they're investing in. And that often means finding out what's called their ticket size. What is the usual amount that they will write as an investment? So for instance, if somebody is a software investor and you have a food company, well, that's not going to work out too well when you contact them. If somebody is a Series B investor and they only write $5 to $30 million checks, and you're trying to raise 150 grand or 500 grand or your first million, that's not going to work out well either. There's this illusion out there that, oh, well, if somebody writes $5 million checks, they might be feel happy to write a small check, because obviously that's inconsequential to them if they're already writing 5 million checks. What that fails to grasp is that somebody who writes a $5 million plus check routinely is doing months of due diligence, has a process that is well defined, that will, target a certain investment hypothesis. And actually writing a small check isn't an easy thing to do. It's an actual impossibility because the rules that they have established for their fund prevent them from writing that small check. I often see people go for investors that are too late stage to invest in their round. The other thing that you need to do once you've identified the stage and you've identified the sector of investor, you need to look at the geography. Are they global? Are they Irish? Are they American? Are they focused on one area or are they in multiple regions? And you also need to look at their investor track record and how close they are to their most recent capital raise. Now, some of that information could be found on sites like PitchBook, but one really useful thing to do is just look at all the press releases that an investor might have made. If you look at SOSV's press releases, you would find that we closed our fund in December last year at $270-odd million. That means that we have dry powder that we're able to deploy, whereas other investors who haven't closed funds recently and haven't announced probably don't have dry powder. And so even if you do approach them, they might show interest, but they don't actually have the money to invest. So homework is essential. You have to find the investor that fits the size. You have to find the investor that fits the area, the geography, and you need to find investors that have money. But then how do you actually approach them? Well, to actually make the connection, there are two things that I think are really worth doing right now. Because even though 80% of the investors that we've seen surveyed have said they're only doing follow-on rounds into existing investments, about 20% of the investors out there are saying they are doing new deals. So how do you get to them? Well, one way is to attend online conferences. There are a lot of investor conferences going on right now where people are matchmaking startups and investors. And the kinds of investors that are actually attending those conferences, well, they're not attending for their health. They're interested in something. So showing up on these online events, finding out where they are and showing up is, in my view, a really good way of making that first investor contact. The best way, though, in my view, to make an investor contact is, again, based on good homework. The first thing you got to do is look at companies that have recently raised rounds from investors. And instead of networking with the CEO of such a company, instead of networking or trying to network with the investor who you won't get to, network with the financial people in that company. See if you can do them some favors. See if you can exchange some information. See if you can be relevant to the CFO or the financial controller of a company that's recently raised from an investor that you're interested in. It's usually pretty easy to get in touch with the finance people. They're not as busy as the CEOs or the marketing people. They're busy, respect their time, but they're often interested in chatting. And they will know their investors. And they will be able to tell you whether that investor was a good investor or not. They'll be able to tell you what the process was like. And more importantly, if you get to know them and like them and do something for them, they are the most likely people to actually make a warm introduction to an investor that you're seeking. And the best way to get connected to an investor is through a warm introduction. And so and this is regardless of whether you're on lockdown or not, this is the time when you can get those warm introductions. This is the time when you can do that homework and prepare yourself. Once you're in touch with an investor, the honest truth is that a lot of investors right now will not be able to complete an investment quickly, because I have yet to see a round close for a new investor where they've just met the founders via Zoom or a teleconference. It's possible, but a lot of investors don't even have the systems to do that. Like, they don't have a way to invest physically. They can't sign the documents electronically. They need to do actual physical due diligence. So in this time, what you're really focused on is building the relationship, getting that warm introduction and building that relationship. Now, the next thing that I'm going to talk about is how you can get their interest after getting that warm introduction. Now, I have a whole thing about presentations that I do, but I'm only going to touch on a few clear things that you must do in a presentation, especially if you're going to be doing a presentation using video conferencing. The first and most important thing, tell a story. I don't mean tell a story like a fairy tale. I mean tell a truthful yet interesting story about the opportunity to invest. You need to make that story simple to understand. It needs to be like a newspaper story. Newspaper stories start with the problem. That's why the headlines are always negative. And then they very quickly talk about the people and the struggle that's going on. And then at the very end, they like to add in some conclusion, some resolution. Maybe it's some good news at the end. In your investment story, it had better be good news at the end. That format, that simple storytelling format, is essential when you're trying to get across your ideas to an investor. You need to tell a story so that they can suspend their disbelief long enough to see you as an opportunity. So many presentations start with the company name and a boring paragraph about what the company does. Just don't do that. You have barely gotten 6 seconds in and your investor is switched off. And you can't tell if you're doing a presentation or a Zoom call whether they're listening to you or whether they're typing on their phone or whether they're distracted by their child. You have to be interesting from the very first word. You have to describe the problem because problems are interesting. And you need to make it very succinct. Once you've got their interest, you need to show them how you're going to make them money. And you need to show them that you've got a great team and a plan. But the team is the next thing after the problem. Because without the team and the hard work you've done to earn your place in whatever industry that you're working in, nobody believes that you have an answer that's worth investing in. The answer that's worth investing in and the return on investment must come after that. Now, there are a bunch of things that investors really, really dislike. And probably first and foremost amongst those is boring presentations. Another thing that investors truly dislike is sole founders that don't have any team, because we know that it is just so hard to make a business work by yourself. And it makes it very hard for you to be investable. Besides which, an investor wants to be part of your team. And if you have no team, well, that's a pretty bad sign to somebody who wants to join your team. You know, you want to have a team already to join. And another thing that investors really don't like is total cold calling. You know, people find you somehow, but they don't get that warm introduction. That speaks of either laziness or being ineffective. Effective people know that you have to network so you get that introduction. Another thing that investors do not like is a lack of clarity. Everything you write, your financials, everything should be super, super crystal clear. And if they're not super crystal clear, that's really a pain for an investor. Another thing investors do not like is secrecy. Do not send me an NDA as the first thing. In fact, never send me an NDA. but particularly don't set it as the first thing. Ideas do not have a lot of value. In fact, you can't patent them, you can't copyright them. You could argue that ideas are totally valueless. Adding secrecy to that valueless idea does not increase its value. It just annoys investors. I've never seen an NDA actually prosecuted in a court. So you've got a document that really doesn't protect you, but it serves to show that you distrust the investor. And it's additional legal work that an investor would have to do in order to be able to sign it, which he or she would have to pay for. So don't do the NDA thing. It's not a sign of professionalism, it's the opposite. Once you've identified your investor and you've found a nice way to get the warm introduction through another startup that's raised through their financial people, and you've got a great presentation and you feel like you're ready, you've got your team together, there's a good reason not to raise money. You see, if you can find a way to get revenue, to build sales, to sell something, anything that builds cash flow into your company before you get investment, that's a really powerful way of increasing your value. That's called accretion. See, no matter what kind of investment you get, it's going to dilute you. That means that you're going to own less of your company at the end of the investment than you did before. On the other hand, if you can accrete value in the company, then even though after an investment, after the accretion, you'll own a little less of your company, you'll own more than you would have without that revenue, without that cash coming in, without that traction. Investors are very tired of seeing businesses that have no sales, no traction, no deals, no money coming in. And in a post-pandemic world, those companies that can actually pull together and bring in cash as sales are going to get into the front of the queue more. And all of this is about getting into that queue because, as I said before, it's likely that you will not be able to get a new investor into your company with a closed round if you don't meet them in person. It can happen, but it's not likely. What's more likely is that you set up everything right so that you get the maximum possible traction with the investors through warm introductions, and you get them fully prepared, and you fill in their time in this time with interesting stuff such that when they come out of lockdown, they are ready to meet you and quickly proceed to due diligence and investment. Now, the more money you can bring in that time, in this time, the more sales you can make. And even if you're just getting creative on how you're actually finding a product to sell, maybe it's not your core product, but maybe you can do something else in this time. Simple pivots, like you've seen most restaurants have gone from serving people seated to doing home delivery. Those sorts of simple pivots could get you to early revenue. That's a great proof point for your investors. When you look at how an investor is going to look at you, it's also important to be super respectful right now. Why? Well, because all investors right now, if they have any size portfolio whatsoever, are dealing with a lot of issues. So at SOSV, we have 1,000 companies in our portfolio, and literally every company is affected by the pandemic in some way, shape, or form. So you can imagine the amount of inbound conversations that I'm having right now, trying to assist in raising money, cutting costs, finding new markets, pivoting to doing something about COVID-19. There's just a lot going on, far more than I've ever had in my life at one time, including, I have 5 different charities that I'm working for. They're all affected as well. So you've got to be super respectful of investors' time. That said, some investors are doing really well right now. You know, I was talking to one yesterday and he said, I'm practically on holiday. You know, we just finished 3 rounds of investment. We've got plenty of dry powder. And because the companies that we've invested in have all raised, we're actually looking for opportunities. That kind of investor is out there. Again, they won't be able to close right now, but they would be great for you to know. Again, if you have exactly the right business for their investment hypothesis. So they have a couple of the things that would make them attractive to, you know, to any company, but then you've got to disqualify them on certain things. So for instance, that investor I just spoke about only invests in the UK, doesn't invest anywhere else. While they've got plenty of time and they're looking for deal flow, they only invest in drugs. They only invest in new novel drugs. So unless you're a UK company with a new pharmaceutical product, they're not going to be an interesting person to chat to, regardless of the fact that they have the time. So it's super, super critical, as I said at the very start, to find exactly the right investor and get that warm introduction, and then be very respectful of their time, and then know that what you're trying to do is get onto their calendar for when you can meet them in person. Now, another thing to be very careful of in this time is don't go out there with the express purpose of raising money visibly. Because a lot of people are going right now saying, we're doing a Series A right now. And what that signals to people when they say, we're doing a Series A right now, and by the way, here's the deadline, you have to get in on this. What that is signaling to investors is, oh, you're desperate for money. And if you signal that you're desperate for money, one of 2 things is going to happen. You're either going to come across a predatory investor who is going to take you on a wild ride because they know you're desperate for money and spin you on, or you're going to come across an investor who understands that why you need to raise money, but they know that you'll do it at a very low valuation. Now, low valuations are better than dying. You know, rule 1, don't die. But if you can avoid that low valuation by holding fire, if you can avoid that low valuation by signaling that you're using this time to prepare for an investment round rather than actually trying to close a round, which again, as I said, may be impossible via conference, you're going to be much better off with that investor, them not thinking you're desperate for money. There are very few legitimate investors that I've ever seen that have ever ripped off a startup. But I do see a whole bunch of chances out there, especially right now, who are talking up big stories of investment, and all they want is a retainer from you or some kind of commitment. They want you to pay them before they will give you money. And that's a disaster. So don't do that. So that's all I have for you today in what I was intending to present. If people have questions, now is a good time to raise your hand in the chat, or raise your hand and I'll turn on your microphone, or you can put something into the chat and I will see it and answer your chat questions. Nobody is asking any questions so far. Angela, are you trying to talk? Ah, Matt. Okay, I'll unmute you. Get the first question because you raised your hand. There you go. Ask away.
Yeah, this is just as much about encouraging everybody else to as well. But actually what my main question is that we have seen locally that a lot of investors are not interested in companies that are pre-revenue. You know, so it's like an investor saying, I want to see a little bit more track record. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to make that, I don't want to use the word worse, but it's going to definitely propagate that feeling.
Yep.
we've seen some responses from the UK government, because we're north of the border, on what we should do, or some questions essentially on what they should do for startups. We have some people that are close to us that think that this is going to be a 6-month blip and then things are going to go back to normal. I think in light of that, I mean, the stuff that you've said is all very sensible, and we've been chatting on a back channel about it. But it's the immediate effects are going to be, obviously people can't meet, and therefore there can't be the proper due diligence. They can't shake you by the hand and look you in the eye.
Yep.
So in that, there is going to be a, you know, in terms of normal operation, there'll be a market failure. What should be done for those companies that are at that stage where they need to raise investment, but literally they needed to get the first product out to allow them build?
So my view,
what do you think the government should be doing to help with that?
So my view on that is that all governments need to invest into the sector in such a way that they can support a pre-revenue company for a period of time. And I find that the measures that are being announced where you have to prove that you've lost revenue are great if you're a restaurant, but they're terrible if you're a startup. And so it's very clear to me that there needs to be some form of pooled government grant or soft loan that allows you to bridge the gap between now and revenue. That said, I'm even more a fan of pivoting in this time to do something that you can get some revenue in. And there are lots of things that need doing. And those can form, if you go to an investor and say, listen, COVID-19 hit us, we were pre-revenue, but we decided to spin up this mask making company, or this tracking system for grandparents, or any number of interesting things that could be done. That story, and showing that you got some revenue with your team, that you went through a mini pivot, that's actually attractive to investors. But from a grant perspective, I think governments really, really, really must do more to support startups. Startups are the future of the economy, and you can't sacrifice your future at this time. So I've got a few other questions in chat. Aoife, what's your advice for fundraising for events, not-for-profit arts taking place in winter? Is there a way to turn uncertainty and event cancellations into an opportunity for Q4 fundraising activities? The best I can suggest for that is Patreon. So there were a number of people that were attending that event that have talents, presumably. And I would get together a group and I would start putting out content and wildly promoting that on TikTok and other social media, but particularly TikTok, because it tends to have a chance to go viral. That's what I would be doing, because right now a lot of people are looking at new and novel content streams, and they are actually paying people via Patreon. And I'm a big fan of Patreon. It's not just for YouTubers, it's for any creative that wants to do something. From Jay Ring. Hey, I've seen there are some hot sectors right now, investors looking at health checks directly related to coronavirus. Maybe you could expand on the markets you and SOSV see as being hot right now. Sure, anything to do with coronavirus is hot. Anything to do with diagnostics is hot. Anything to do with therapeutics that are short-term is hot. Anything to do with contact tracing. Also, online education, homeschooling support, PPE manufacturer. All of these things are hot areas. If you can adapt and you can build something quickly and get it out there, you have an opportunity, because there's a lot of audience at home looking for things. And you can actually look at some of this just by looking at the keyword search costs in Google. There are some keywords that are going through the roof, like vaccine, and other keywords that are dead as doornails right now. So there's a great way to track how you can find that hot market. And then Michael McDowell, how should early stage startups view taking on debt at this time? Could it harm in future investment rounds? Yes, debt can be harmful. My advice to anyone who is taking on debt is check the terms. There's a lot of soft loans out there that are fine to take, but there are also predatory lenders Do not take something that's going to weigh down and kill your next round because you've just indebted the whole company and secured it to somebody who is going to try and take you out afterwards. I recently had a strategic investor destroy the value in a company because they made a takeover bid after pulling half their debt. So a lot of debt, they'd taken on debt, they'd built plans, they'd spent money, and then their debt investor pulled half that money and said, no, sorry, we're not going to give you any more. But here's a takeover offer at just over 10 cents on the dollar that other people invested in and that you as founders put in. So just be super careful with the terms on debt right now. But generally speaking, the soft loans that are available are okay. Any other questions while I'm here? Oh, cheers from Michael. Thank you very much. We have plenty of time though for more. Micro pivot ideas. Okay, let's talk about that. So from Matt, I'm interested in the micro pivot ideas. Okay, great. One of the things that I do is I'm an investor in a bunch of biotech startups. And right now, fully 3/4 of them have pivoted to do something regarding COVID-19. And they're either selling product right now or they're gotten a hold of a COVID-19 grant from either the EU, the US, or the UK. So for instance, one group has a bunch of what's called PCR machines that they use in their research. And they've now set up a diagnostic lab around their PCR machines. They got a small grant to do that, and they're now selling tests at a commercial rate. And they're processing, I think it's 200 tests a day in the UK. So, they're making good money from that, you know, because testing is a paid for service there. As it is everywhere else. Another company I know has, pivoted from doing advertising, online advertising tracking. They are now actually doing viral hotspot tracking. So what they're doing is they're looking at where people are viewing the online ads that they serve, and they're looking for areas where people are congregating in countries where there's lockdown and there shouldn't be congregation, and they're highlighting, and they're being paid by the government of various countries to highlight where those hotspots are. And they're actually doing it fully GDPR compliant. They're not giving away any user data. They're not giving away any personal identification. But what they are doing is checking where people are intersecting, and where they have a tag for someone who has actually gotten the disease or is likely to have gotten the disease, they're further highlighting that hotspot. Again, without revealing any personal data, and they're making good money at that. And there are actually grants and donations available out there for supporting pivots to COVID-19. There's a site, quickgrants.com, that people can go to and look for these various grants that would enable you to pivot on various topics. So any other questions out there? Still quite a few people online. I've said pretty much everything that I need to say about fundraising, but more questions, the better. And again, raise your hand if you want me to unmute you. And the raising of hand isn't done by the camera, it's done by the app. So there's a button you can test. You can click to mute, to raise your hand. Oh, and by the way, just in case, I am not DC. I am just using his account at his invitation. Well, if there are no more questions, I think that'll be it. Oh, one more question. Oh no, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Frank. Thank you, everyone. Bye.